In the unforgiving dust of the Wyoming Territory, justice wasn't a lady with scales, but a man with a rope. And in redemption, Gulch, that rope was already being measured for Jane Finch. Accused of murdering the most powerful man for 100 miles, she stood alone in a makeshift courtroom, a saloon filled with hostile eyes and the stench of cheap whiskey. Her fate was sealed. The judge was ready to convict the crowd, was ready to hang, and no one was coming to save her. But they were wrong. The double doors of the saloon were about to swing open, and a man who was more ghost than human, a man feared by every settler in the territory, would walk in, face them all down, and tell a lie that would change everything. The air in the Gilded Cage Saloon was thick enough to chew. It clung to the back of the throat, a foul cocktail of stale beer sweat and the suffocating dust that was the lifeblood and curse of Redemption Gulch. It was August of 1876, and the heat was a physical presence, a merciless weight pressing down on the town. But for Jane Finch, the heat was nothing compared to the icy dread coiling in her gut. She sat on a hastily cleared poker table, her hands bound in front of her. This table was her defense stand. The saloon itself, with its grimy bar and leering paintings of scandalous women, was her courtroom. And the jury, every drunk ranch hand and merchant in town who had ever bowed and scraped before the man she was accused of killing, Jedediah Kane. Kane had been the town's patriarch, its king. He owned the biggest cattle ranch, the Mercantile, and most people whispered the sheriff. He was a man built of hard angles and harder bargains, with a reputation for acquiring land through means that were never fully investigated. 3 days ago, he'd been found dead at the edge of his property, near the small homestead claimed by Jane. He had a single clean hole from a .44 caliber bullet in his chest. His own Colt Peacemaker was still in its holster. The accusation had been swift and absolute. Jane Finch was the perfect suspect. She was an outsider, a woman who had arrived 2 years prior with little more than a mule, a set of worn tools, and a quiet determination that the locals mistook for arrogance. She worked her claim alone, turning the stubborn soil her face weathered by the sun, her hands calloused and capable. She kept to herself, her past a closed book, and that made people nervous. Worse, she had openly defied Jedediah Kane. He'd made no secret of his desire for her land. Its creek was the last reliable water source he didn't control. He had offered to buy her out, his offers little more than veiled threats. When she refused, his visits became more frequent, his tone more menacing. The entire town knew of their feud. So when he was found dead, a stone's throw from her fence line, the conclusion was immediate and foregone. Sheriff Brody Hicks, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced with gelatin, had led the posse. He'd found a single spent .44 casing near the fence post on Jane's property. It was the same caliber as the Winchester rifle she kept leaned against her cabin door. He hadn't bothered to look for other tracks, other signs. He had his suspect, and that was enough for Redemption Gulch. Now she faced Judge Thaddeus Grimshaw, a circuit judge whose righteousness was as severe as his stark black coat. His face, a roadmap of scowls and grim pronouncements, was set in stone. He saw a simple case, a troublesome woman, a dead land baron, and the swift application of frontier justice. Jane Finch, Judge Grimshaw's voice, boomed, silencing the low murmur of the saloon. You stand accused of the willful and malicious murder of Mr. Jedediah Kane. The evidence presented by Sheriff Hicks is compelling. A known dispute over land, a threat witnessed by several upstanding citizens, and the means to commit the act found on your property. How do you plead? Every eye was on her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their hunger for a resolution, for a spectacle. They didn't want truth. They wanted a hanging. She lifted her chin, her voice raspy from dust and fear, but clear. "Not guilty, Your Honor." A derisive snort came from the bar. It was Bartholomew Kane, Jedediah's son. He was a softer, crueler version of his father, with pale, resentful eyes. "She's a liar. My father told me she threatened him, said if he set foot on her land again, she'd put him in the ground." Ain't that right, boys? A chorus of agreement came from the cluster of Kane's ranch hands. They were the witnesses, men who owed their livelihoods to the Kane family, now eager to pay their respects by delivering the woman who defied him to the gallows. "I told him to stay off my property." Jane clarified her gaze, fixed on the judge. "That is the right of any landowner, a right you chose to enforce with a rifle," the judge retorted, his tone dripping with skepticism. "No, I didn't shoot Mr. Kane. I was in my cabin all evening. I saw no one, heard nothing but the wind. No witnesses to confirm your whereabouts, of course," Judge Grimshaw said, as if stating the final nail in her coffin. "A convenient solitude." Jane's heart sank. It was the truth. Her only neighbors were the coyotes and the endless sagebrush. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The trial, she realized, was just a performance, a play they had to act out before the final grisly act. Sheriff Hicks looked away, unable to meet her gaze, polishing a smudge on his badge. Bartholomew sneered. The judge shuffled his papers, his decision already written in the lines on his face. The sun beat down on the saloon's roof. Inside, the heat was building the air, growing staler. Despair, cold and sharp, began to pierce through her resolve. This was it. This was how her story ended, framed for a murder she didn't commit in a dusty, God-forsaken town that had already decided she was guilty. She closed her eyes for a brief second, a silent prayer forming on her lips, not for salvation, but for strength to face the end with dignity. That's when the saloon doors creaked open. The creak of the doors was a sound lost in the general hum of the saloon, but the sudden shift in light was not. A tall, long shadow fell across the dusty floorboards, stretching like a dark omen towards the judge's table. The murmurings of the crowd didn't just quiet, they ceased, replaced by a sudden, collective intake of breath. The air, already thick with tension, became sharp and brittle. Every man in the Gilded Cage saloon turned. Their hands, which had been resting on mugs of beer or drumming on tables, instinctively moved closer to the pistols on their hips. Even Judge Grimshaw paused, his pronouncement dying in his throat. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white blaze of the afternoon sun, was a man who was less a part of the landscape and more a force of nature that passed through it. He was Lakota. But he wasn't just any Lakota. He was the one they spoke of in hushed tones around campfires, the subject of frightened whispers and exaggerated tales. The settlers had given him a name of their own, one born of fear and rumor, Ghost Bear. His people called him Matowanagi. He was tall and lean, with the fluid grace of a predator. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a worn linen shirt, likely traded or scavenged. His face was a mask of hard-won severity, framed by two long dark braids. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were dark and piercing, moving with an unnerving slowness, assessing every man, every threat, with an unnerving calm. He carried no rifle, but a long-bladed knife was sheathed at his belt, its presence more menacing than any firearm. He was known as a warrior who had not surrendered to the reservations, a phantom of the plains who still lived by the old ways, and his presence this deep into settler territory was an unprecedented and terrifying event. He took one step into the room and then another. The floorboards groaned under his moccasins, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead silence. He paid no mind to the armed men, to the glowering face of Bartholomew Kane, or to the shocked expression of Sheriff Hicks. His gaze swept past them all until it landed on Jane, seated at the poker table, her hands bound her face, pale. For a moment their eyes met, across the hostile room. Jane's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized him. A memory sharp and vivid from a year ago, a secret act of mercy she had never spoken of to a soul rushed back to her. But why was he here? What could he possibly do? Matawanagi's focus shifted to Judge Grimshaw. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the building. It was laced with an accent, but the words were clear, deliberate, and chilling. "This is your place of law?" He asked a simple question that sounded like an accusation. Judge Grimshaw, recovering from his shock, puffed out his chest. "This is a court of the United States government, and you are interrupting its proceedings. State your business or be removed." Removed. A flicker of something. Not amusement, but a deep, cold irony touched the Lakota's eyes. He gestured with his chin towards Sheriff Hicks, who looked as if he'd rather wrestle a grizzly than confront the man in the doorway. By him, Sheriff Hicks swallowed hard, his hand hovering over his gun, but making no move to draw it. "What do you want?" Bartholomew Kane snarled, stepping forward. "This is white man's business. Get out before you're thrown out." Matawanagi ignored him completely, his attention remaining fixed on the judge. "I am here for the woman," he said. "Jane Finch." The saloon erupted in a low, dangerous growl. "She is a murderer," Bartholomew shouted. "And she's going to hang for it. She is accused," the judge corrected, though his tone suggested it was a mere formality. "And she will be tried according to our laws. Her fate is a matter for this court, not for you." Matawanagi took another slow step forward, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. He stopped in the center of the floor, a lone, unmovable rock in a river of hostility. "You are mistaken," he said, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the simmering rage of the crowd. "Her fate is not for you to decide. She cannot be tried by your law." Judge Grimshaw's face purpled with indignation. "And why is that? Is she a citizen of the Lakota nation? Now did she renounce her own people?" The next words that came from Matawanagi's mouth were the spark that lit the powder keg. He looked directly at Jane, a silent communication passing between them that she could not comprehend. Then, turning his gaze back to the stunned and furious judge, he delivered the lie that would shatter the proceedings. "She is protected by the law of the people," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Because she is my wife." The silence that followed Matawanagi's declaration was a living thing. It was heavier than the oppressive heat, deeper than the town's well. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Men who had been ready to string Jane up from the nearest cottonwood now stood frozen, their mouths agape. Bartholomew Kane's face, contorted with vengeful glee only a moment before, was now a mask of slack-jawed disbelief. Jane felt the world tilt on its axis. Wife. The word echoed in the cavern of her mind, nonsensical and terrifying. She stared at the Lakota warrior, at his unyielding back, at the sheer impossible audacity of his claim. It was a lie. A blatant, world-altering lie. But why Judge Grimshaw was the first to find his voice sputtering like a faulty steam engine? "Wife, that's preposterous. Absurd. There's no record, no license, no ceremony." Matawanagi turned his head slightly, not enough to break his focus, but enough to acknowledge the judge's outburst. "Your records are not my records. Your ceremonies are not my ceremonies. Your laws," he said, letting the words hang in the air with profound disdain, are not my laws. He's lying, Bartholomew Kane finally roared, finding his footing. He pointed a trembling finger at the warrior. He's a savage trying to protect a killer. Sheriff, arrest him. Arrest them both. Sheriff Hicks looked from the furious scion of the Kane family to the still imposing figure of Ghost Bear, and seemed to shrink inside his own uniform. He made a half-hearted move, his hand falling to the butt of his Colt, but he looked like a man being asked to pet a rattlesnake. "Now hold on, Bartholomew." The sheriff mumbled his voice, lacking any real authority. Let's not be hasty." Matawanagi's gaze settled on Jane. "Is what I say untrue?" he asked, his dark eyes boring into hers. It was a question, but it was also a command, an instruction. In that moment, Jane understood. This was a lifeline, a desperate, insane gamble thrown to her from the most unexpected quarter imaginable. To deny it would be to accept the noose. To agree would be to step off a cliff into an unknown abyss. He was offering her a shield forged from the town's own fear of him. Her throat was dry as dust. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the hard, unforgiving eyes, the mouths twisted in contempt. She looked at the judge, whose verdict was already decided. She looked at the rope burns she could almost feel on her neck. Then she looked back at the man they called Ghost Bear. His expression was unreadable, but in the depths of his eyes she saw a flicker of something. A promise. A debt being repaid. Taking a ragged breath, she found her voice. It was barely a whisper, but in the dead quiet of the saloon, it sounded like a cannon shot. "It is true," she said, the lie tasting foreign and bitter on her tongue. "He is my husband." Chaos erupted. The men shouted, gesticulated their disbelief turning to outrage. "She's lying to save her skin. Since when do we recognize Indian weddings? This is a mockery of the law." Judge Grimshaw slammed his gavel, a repurposed whiskey bottle, onto the bar. The crash of glass on wood was sharp, but did little to quell the uproar. "Order. Order in this court," he bellowed, his face flushed with fury. "This changes nothing. A claim made under duress, with no proof whatsoever. It is a desperate ploy, and it will not stand." "It is not a ploy," Matawanagi's voice cut through the noise, calm and sharp as obsidian. "It is Lakota law. A woman married to one of our people is under our protection. You touch her, you declare war on us. Is the life of one dead man worth that to you, Judge?" He wasn't just addressing Grimshaw. He was speaking to every man in the room. He was reminding them of the Sand Creek massacre, of Custer's recent bloody end at the Little Bighorn. He was invoking the deep-seated fear of an Indian war, a fear that haunted every isolated settlement on the frontier. Redemption Gulch was a speck in a vast, untamed wilderness, a wilderness that was still the domain of men like him. The judge paled. The threat, though unspoken, was brutally clear. To hang Jane now was to potentially sign the death warrant for the entire town. The legal quandary was secondary to the primal matter of survival. "This is highly irregular," Grimshaw stammered, falling back on legalistic jargon to mask his sudden uncertainty. "There are treaties, jurisdictions. Your treaties are broken pieces of paper," Matawanagi said flatly. "My word is not. I have made my claim. Now provide your proof that she killed this man." He turned his head, his piercing gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Not your whispers. Not your suspicions. Proof." He then did something that stunned them all into another silence. He walked with the same deliberate, unhurried pace through the crowd of hostile men who parted before him like the Red Sea. He walked to the poker table where Jane sat, and with two swift, powerful movements, he broke the cheap rope binding her wrists. The fibers snapped with a sharp crack. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply stood beside her, a silent, unmovable guardian. His presence had transformed the entire dynamic of the room. A moment ago, she was a lone woman at the mercy of a mob. Now she was under the protection of the most feared man in the territory. Jane rubbed her raw wrists, her mind reeling. The trial had been derailed. The certainty of the verdict had been shattered. But as she stood up, shaky and uncertain, beside the man who had just called her his wife, she knew this was far from over. It was merely the beginning of a new and perhaps even more dangerous trial. The gilded cage saloon, which had been a courtroom on the verge of a death sentence, was now a powder keg with a lit fuse. The men of Redemption Gulch were caught between two powerful opposing forces, their ingrained fear of the Lakota and their furious desire for retribution against the woman they believed had murdered Jedediah Kane. Judge Grimshaw, flustered and outmaneuvered, saw his authority evaporating. He couldn't simply hang her now. Ghost Bear's threat, though veiled, was potent, but he couldn't let her walk free either. The Kane family's influence was the bedrock of his power in this territory. He needed a way to save face. "This court is recessed," he finally declared, his voice straining. "The prisoner Jane Finch will be remanded to the custody of Sheriff Hicks while this extraordinary claim is considered. We will reconvene tomorrow at noon." He glared at Matowanagi. "And you? Your presence will be required. If you are making a claim in a court of law, you will be subject to its questions." Matowanagi gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had won the first battle, buying time, which was more precious than gold. Sheriff Hicks, looking deeply unhappy, gestured with his pistol. "All right, you two. Let's go." To the jailhouse. As they walked towards the door, the crowd parted their expressions, a mixture of fear, hatred, and confusion. Jane could feel their eyes on her back, burning with a new kind of animosity. Before she was just a murderer. Now she was a murderer who had allied herself with their most primal enemy. She was a traitor to her own kind. The jailhouse was a squat, sun-baked wooden box containing 2 small cells and a tiny office. Sheriff Hicks locked Jane in one, the iron door clanging shut with a dreadful finality. He then turned to Matowanagi, who had followed them inside his presence, seeming to shrink the small room. "And you," the sheriff said, gesturing to the other cell. "You're not under arrest, but I can't have you wandering the town. You'll stay here, for your own protection as much as anyone else's." Matowanagi looked at the cramped, filthy cell, and then back at the sheriff, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he stepped inside and sat on the hard, packed dirt floor. His back straight, his composure absolute. He did not seem like a prisoner, but like a king holding court in a dungeon. The sheriff, seemingly relieved to have them both contained, retreated to his office, leaving them in the dim, stifling heat of the cell block. The silence was heavy, broken only by the buzzing of flies. Jane sat on the edge of the hard cot, her head in her hands. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a trembling exhaustion and 1,000 frantic questions. Finally, she spoke, her voice, a low whisper, across the narrow walkway separating their cells. Why, she asked, not looking at him. "Why did you do that?" He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her. "You saved my life," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A debt must be paid. By lying to a whole town and claiming me as your wife," she shot back, a note of hysteria creeping into her voice. "By putting yourself in this much danger, they'll kill you. They are afraid," he stated simply, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "Fear is a weapon. Today I used it for you." Jane looked up, her eyes meeting his through the bars. They won't stay afraid forever. A judge, lawyers. They'll find a way around your claim. This has just delayed the inevitable. Time is what you needed, he replied. The truth does not run on a judge's schedule. It must be hunted. His eyes narrowed slightly. You did not kill him. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. No, she whispered, a lump forming in her throat. I swear I didn't. Then who did I don't know? I was home all night. Jedediah Kane had enemies, plenty of them. Men he cheated, homesteaders he pushed off their land. It could have been anyone. But they chose you, Mata Wanagi said, because you were alone. An easy story to tell. He shifted his movements, economical and precise. Tell me about the man. The one who was killed. Jane found herself talking the words, spilling out in a rush. She told him about Kane's relentless pressure, his threats disguised as offers. She told him about Bartholomew's sneering arrogance, and about the ranch hands who treated their land like a personal fiefdom. She described the layout of her homestead, the creek, the fence line where the body was found. He listened without interruption, his focus absolute. He was not just hearing her words, he was absorbing them, analyzing them, searching for the spaces in between. He was a hunter, and he was tracking a new kind of prey, the truth. The shell casing the sheriff found, he said when she had finished. On your land. He showed it to you. Yes, she nodded. A .44, from a Winchester, he said. Like mine. But not from yours, he countered. A rifle fired leaves its own mark, like a footprint. No two are the same. Did the sheriff compare the casing to one fired from your rifle? Jane's mind raced. No, he just took my rifle and the casing. He said it was all the proof he needed. A long silence settled between them again. From the office they could hear the low murmur of voices. Sheriff Hicks was talking to someone. The voice that replied was sharp and angry, easily identifiable as Bartholomew Kane's. Can't just let him get away with this, Sheriff. An Indian walks in and tells a fairy tale and you just roll over. My father deserves justice. I'm handling it. Bartholomew, the sheriff's weary voice replied. The judge is looking into the legalities. We have to do this by the book. The book? Bartholomew scoffed. There's no book for this. You should have formed a posse and run that savage out of town the second he showed his face. Mata Wanagi's expression did not change, but Jane could feel a subtle shift in the air, a sharpening of his attention. He was listening, gathering information, his mind working far beyond the confines of his cell. She realized then what he had truly given her. It wasn't just a clever lie or a temporary reprieve. He had given her an ally, the one man in the entire territory who was not bound by the town's prejudices or intimidated by the Kane family's power. He was an outsider just like her, but where her isolation was a weakness, his was a weapon. He could see what they couldn't, and he wasn't afraid to look. The weight of the lie they had told was immense, a fragile shield that could shatter at any moment. But for the first time since Jedediah Kane's body had been found, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of Jane's despair. The memory was etched into Jane's mind as sharply as a winter frost. It was from the previous year during the wolf moon, when the snow lay deep and merciless across the plains, and the wind carried a razor's edge. A blizzard had raged for 3 days, burying the world in a shroud of white. When it finally broke, leaving behind a pristine, silent landscape, Jane had ventured out to check her snares. It was near the frozen creek, half hidden in a snowdrift beneath a cluster of aspens that she found him. At first she thought it was a dead wolf, or a deer, a dark shape against the stark white. But then she saw the human form. It was Mata Wanagi. She knew who he was. Every settler did. Ghost Bear. A phantom of the plains, a holdout from a world that was rapidly vanishing. The stories said he was a ruthless warrior, a ghost who could appear and disappear at will. They said he was the reason cattle vanished, and why lone travelers were never seen again. She should have been terrified. She should have turned her back, gone home, and pretended she'd seen nothing. It was the smart thing to do the safe thing. But he was clearly dying. His leg was mangled, caught in a rusty, long-abandoned bear trap, the steel teeth buried deep in his flesh. A dark, frozen stain of blood blossomed in the snow around him. His face was pale beneath his dark skin, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was barely conscious, but his eyes, when they fluttered open, still held a defiant fire. Compassion, a force more powerful than fear, took hold of her. She saw not a feared warrior, but a fellow human being at the mercy of the brutal wilderness they both called home. Getting him out of the trap was a nightmare. She had to use a sturdy branch as a lever, putting her entire weight against the rusted springs, her muscles screaming in the frigid air. He made no sound, though the pain must have been excruciating. Once he was free, the real challenge began. He was a tall man, and though weakened, he was a heavy weight. She half-dragged, half-carried him back to her small sodded cabin, her lungs burning every step a monumental effort. Inside, she laid him on her own cot by the small stove. The wound was horrific. The leg was broken, and the flesh was torn and blackened with frostbite. By all rights, he should lose it if he didn't die of infection first. For the next week, her cabin became a secret hospital. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and the last of her precious whiskey. She used her sewing needles to stitch the torn flesh, and she set the bone as best she could, splinting it with boards from a broken crate. He drifted in and out of consciousness, delirious with fever. In his lucid moments, he watched her, his dark eyes following her every move. He never spoke a word of English, and she spoke no Lakota. Their communication was one of gestures of shared understanding. She would offer him broth, and he would nod. She would tend to the wound, and he would endure it with a stoicism that was both admirable and terrifying. She risked everything for him. If anyone from town had decided to pay a surprise visit, they would both have been doomed. Harboring a hostile was a death sentence in itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind sent a jolt of fear through her. Yet she continued. On the 8th day, his fever broke. He woke up, his eyes clear for the first time. He sat up, looked at his splintered leg and then at her. He spoke then, his voice low and raspy in his own tongue. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was gratitude. He stayed for 2 more weeks, slowly regaining his strength. He was a quiet, unobtrusive guest. He would watch her as she worked, his expression thoughtful. He carved a small piece of wood, his long-bladed knife, moving with practiced skill until he had fashioned a small, intricate feather. The day he left was as sudden as his arrival. He stood, testing his weight on the healing leg. It was still weak, but he could stand. He walked to the door and turned to her. He pressed the small wooden feather into her palm and closed her fingers around it. Then he spoke again, a single phrase in his language. He repeated it, pointing to himself, then to her, making a gesture that seemed to bind them together. It was a promise, a vow. She didn't understand its literal meaning, but she felt its weight. It was a bond forged not of words, but of action and sacrifice. Then he was gone, melting back into the landscape, as if he'd never been there at all. She had hidden the wooden feather away, a memento of her secret, a secret that defined her separation from the people of Redemption Gulch. Now, sitting in the jail cell, the memory was as clear as the afternoon light slanting through the barred window. The lie he had told was not born of thin air. It was his interpretation of the vow he had made in her cabin. He had promised her his protection, and in his culture that was a bond as strong as any marriage vow sworn before a preacher. He was repaying his debt in the only way he knew how, by offering her his name, his protection, and the fear that came with it. He was shielding her with his very existence, just as she had shielded him from the unforgiving winter. The following morning, Redemption Gulch was a town holding its breath. Judge Grimshaw, after a sleepless night, consulting a dusty law book and Sheriff Hicks's near non-existent territorial statutes, was no closer to a solution. There was no precedent for a Lakota warrior claiming a white woman as his wife in the middle of a murder trial. To dismiss the claim was to risk Ghost Bear's wrath. To accept it was to let a murderer, as he saw her, walk free. He chose a third option, to stall, and to try and publicly discredit the claim. The saloon was even more packed than the day before. The trial reconvened with Jane and Matowanagi brought from the jail. This time he was not left to stand in the doorway. The judge, in a petty display of authority, ordered a chair be placed for him near Jane, making him an official, if unwelcome, part of the proceedings. The court has considered the unusual circumstances. Judge Grimshaw began, his voice heavy with disapproval. While this court does not officially recognize tribal unions as legally binding in this territory, we are in the interest of avoiding misunderstanding, willing to hear you out. He fixed his gaze on Matowanagi. You claim this woman is your wife. When did this union take place? Matowanagi was silent for a moment. Time is measured by seasons, not by the numbers on your paper calendar. We were joined after the last winter. How convenient, Bartholomew Kane sneered from his place at the bar. A secret wedding with no witnesses. There were witnesses, Matowanagi, replied, his voice even. The sky was a witness. The earth was a witness. The Creator was a witness. These are the only ones that matter. The poetic, almost spiritual answer clearly infuriated the judge. That is not an answer this court will accept. I'm talking about people. Men did a preacher oversee this, a justice of the peace. Any white man at all. Your ways are not our ways, Matowanagi said simply, a statement that offered no purchase for the judge's legalistic attacks. While the judge fumed, trying to trap him in a web of unfamiliar laws and customs, Matowanagi's attention was elsewhere. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were not on the judge. They were scanning the room, observing the men who had testified against Jane. He watched the Kane ranch hands, noting their nervous swagger. He watched Bartholomew, seeing the venom and entitlement in his posture. And he watched the lawman, Sheriff Hicks, with his perpetually worried expression, and his deputy, a quiet, weaselly man named Silas Reed, who stood by the door, his hand never far from his gun. And you claim you were with the defendant on the night of the murder? The judge pressed on changing tactics. An alibi is it she was with me, Matowanagi stated. From sundown until the morning star was in the sky. Doing what the question was lewd, intended to embarrass and discredit. Matowanagi's gaze finally snapped to the judge, and for the first time, a dangerous glint appeared in his eyes. That is the business of a husband and wife. It is not for the ears of strangers. The simple, dignified reply left the judge speechless. He had tried to expose the claim as a sham, but the Lakota's unwavering calm and refusal to be drawn into their world of legalistic squabbles made him seem more believable, not less. He was operating on a different plane of existence, and their rules simply didn't touch him. The proceedings droned on a pointless exercise. The judge, realizing he was getting nowhere, finally called for another recess, demanding the sheriff find some kind of proof to refute the alibi, an impossible task. As Sheriff Hicks led them back to the jail, Matowanagi spoke to him, his voice low. "I wish to see the place where the man was found." Hicks balked. "Now why would I do that? It's a crime scene. The crime has already happened." "The killer has not been found," Matowanagi countered. "Perhaps you missed something. The implication was clear. Your investigation was incompetent." The sheriff, stung by the remark, but also strangely intrigued, hesitated. Maybe the Indian could see something he'd missed. Desperate for any break that didn't involve confronting the Kane family or the Lakota, he reluctantly agreed. "Fine. But you'll be cuffed, and Deputy Reed will be with me." Leaving Jane locked in her cell, the three men rode out to the edge of Kane's property. The spot was marked by a trampled area of scrub grass and a dark, ominous stain on the soil. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plains. Sheriff Hicks pointed. He was found right there, shot from the direction of Finch's fence line about 50 yards that way. Matowanagi dismounted. Cuffed hands did little to hinder him. He moved like a naturalist in his element, his eyes scanning not the obvious but the periphery. He ignored the spot where the body had lain, and instead walked the fence line, his gaze sweeping the ground, the posts, the tangled weeds. He moved with a patience that the white men found unnerving. Silas Reed, the deputy, watched him, with a nervous energy, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "He's wasting our time, Brody. What's he gonna find that we didn't?" But Matowanagi had stopped. He knelt, his eyes fixed on a spot of disturbed dirt near the base of a fence post. The same post Sheriff Hicks claimed he found the .44 casing near. He didn't touch anything. He just looked. "Two men stood here," he said, his voice quiet. "Not one." "What are you talking about?" the sheriff asked, walking over. "The tracks are all gone now. The wind takes the tracks from the flat ground first," Matowanagi explained, pointing with his chin. "But here beside the post, the grass holds the story. See two sets of boot prints. Faint. One with a worn heel like yours, Sheriff. The other, different. Smaller. No spur mark." He then moved his gaze from the ground to a few feet away into a patch of stubborn, thorny bushes. He stared into the tangle of branches for a long moment. Then he looked at Deputy Silas Reed. "Your gun," Matowanagi said. "It is a Colt like the sheriff's." Silas stiffened his hand, flying to the pistol on his hip. "It's a Colt Peacemaker. Standard issue." "What's it to you?" Matowanagi's eyes flickered back to the bush. "A big gun. A soldier's gun. The man Kane was shot with, a .44. A rifle bullet, you said." "That's right," the sheriff confirmed. "The casing we found. But a man does not always hunt with his biggest gun." Matowanagi mused almost to himself. He stood up and took a step toward Silas Reed. The deputy instinctively took a step back, his face pale. A flicker of understanding, cold and sharp, ignited in Matowanagi's mind. He had seen fear in the saloon, but this was different. This wasn't the fear of a supernatural warrior. This was the fear of a liar, the fear of a guilty man. He turned to the sheriff. "Let us go back," he said. "I have seen enough." As they rode back to town, Matowanagi was silent, his face a stony mask. But behind his eyes the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The easy accusation, the convenient evidence, the nervous deputy. The truth he was hunting was close. He could feel it. And it was hiding in plain sight, right under the sheriff's nose. The saloon was quiet when they returned to town. The trial was adjourned until morning, and the nervous energy of the day had given way to the sullen, watchful drinking of the evening. Sheriff Hicks locked Matowanagi back in his cell opposite Jane. "What did you see?" she whispered, immediately her face pressed against the bars. "Did you find anything?" "A story," he replied, his voice a low murmur. "The ground tells a story if you know how to read it, but the story is not complete." He sat on the dirt floor, the epitome of patience. He knew the final piece of the puzzle would not be found in the dirt, but in the heart of a guilty man. And a guilty man under pressure will always make a mistake. The hours ticked by. Darkness fell over Redemption Gulch. The sounds of the saloon grew louder, then softer as the night wore on. Through it all, Matowanagi sat watchful and silent. The mistake came just after midnight. The door to the jailhouse creaked open. A figure entered, carrying a lantern. It was Deputy Silas Reed. He didn't seem to notice that Matowanagi was wide awake, watching him from the shadows of his cell. "Sheriff sent me," Silas mumbled, not looking at either of them. To check the locks, he walked over to Jane's cell, his movements jerky and unnatural. He fumbled with the key, his hand shaking slightly. He wasn't checking the lock, he was testing it. He glanced nervously back towards the door, then at the silent form in the other cell. Matowanagi spoke, his voice soft, but carrying in the stillness. "You are afraid of the dark." Deputy Silas jumped, startled. "I ain't afraid of nothing. Just doing my job. Your job is to protect the innocent." Matowanagi said, "Is that what you are doing? She's not innocent." Silas snapped, his voice too loud, too defensive. "She killed him." Matowanagi rose to his feet in a single fluid motion. No. The boot prints by the fence told a different story. One man waiting, another arriving. They talk, they argue. Not a woman shooting from 50 yards away. Two men standing close. Silas's face was slick with sweat in the lantern light. "You're crazy. You saw shadows." "I saw the truth," Matowanagi continued, his voice relentless. "And I saw something else. In the thorn bush. Something small and shiny." He paused, letting the silence stretch, like a shell casing, but not from a rifle. Small, from a pocket gun, a gambler's gun. A Remington Derringer, perhaps, every drop of color drained from Silas Reed's face. He stared, horrified. "Jedediah Kane owned you," Matowanagi went on, his voice a low, damning whisper. "He held your gambling debts. He was threatening to expose you, to ruin you. So you agreed to meet him. You said you'd pay him. But you didn't bring money. You brought a Derringer hidden in your pocket. You argued and you shot him. A coward's gun for a coward's murder." No. Silas stammered, backing away. "Then you panicked. You knew they would suspect you, so you created a new story. You took a spent shell from your pocket, one you picked up from target practice, and you dropped it by the fence on her land. You told the sheriff you found it there." You pointed the finger at the lonely woman, the perfect scapegoat. "Shut up," Silas shrieked, his composure shattering. His hand dropped not to his Colt, but to his vest pocket. It was an unconscious, damning reflex. He drew a small, silver-plated Remington Derringer. At that exact moment, the jailhouse door swung open again. Sheriff Brody Hicks stood there, his face grim. "I thought I might find you here, Silas. The Lakota. He told me to wait outside, and to listen." Silas Reed's world collapsed. He was trapped. With a desperate cry, he lunged not at the sheriff or the Lakota, but at Jane's cell. Jamming the Derringer between the bars, pointed directly at her. "Don't move, Brody, I'll kill her, I swear it." Everything happened in a heartbeat. Before the sheriff could even draw his weapon, Matowanagi acted. With a powerful explosive movement, he slammed his shoulder into his own cell door. The cheap iron lock rusted, and weak burst from the wooden frame with a splintering crack. He was out. In 2 long strides, he crossed the narrow space. He didn't go for the gun. He grabbed Silas's wrist with one hand, twisting it with brutal efficiency. Bones snapped. The derringer clattered to the floor. With his other hand, he slammed the deputy against the bars, the man's head hitting the iron with a sickening thud. Silas crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. Sheriff Hicks stood his Colt, finally in his hand, looking down at the groaning form of his deputy, then at the broken cell door, and finally at Mato-Wanagi, who stood over the fallen man, his expression as fierce and unforgiving as a winter storm. Jane was free. The truth hunted and cornered had finally been brought into the light, not by law or order, but by the relentless gaze of a man who lived by a different code. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, with fingers of pale gold, as two figures on horseback rode out of Redemption Gulch. They didn't look back. The town had nothing left for them. Jane Finch was cleared of all charges, her name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. Sheriff Hicks, shamed into action, had secured his deputy and begun the long process of writing a report that would omit as much of his own incompetence as possible. Jane rode the mule she had arrived with. Mato-Wanagi had acquired a horse, and he rode beside her. They hadn't spoken much. There were no words for the ordeal they had passed through. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice quiet in the vastness of the prairie. He looked towards the distant hazy outline of the Black Hills, a sacred place for his people. "To the people," he said, "and you." She looked at the endless horizon, a canvas of uncertainty and possibility. "I don't know. I can't go back to the homestead. Not now." She was still an outsider now more than ever. He was silent for a time, watching the sun climb higher. "You saved my life," he said, not looking at her. "I paid the debt. The vow is fulfilled. You are free to go where you wish." She knew he was right. They were even. They owed each other nothing. And yet leaving him riding off in a different direction felt wrong, impossible. They were bound by something deeper than a life debt. They were bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone, to be judged, and to survive against all odds. "The claim you made," she said softly, "in the saloon. You called me your wife." "It was a weapon made of words," he replied. "To protect you." "I know," she said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the small, intricately carved wooden feather he had given her. She held it out to him. "Is that just a weapon, too?" He stopped his horse and looked at the feather in her palm. He looked at her face, weathered by the sun, and by hardship, at the strength in her eyes. He reached out, but not to take the feather. His fingers gently closed hers around it. "No," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "That is a promise. A new story, if you wish to help me write it." He did not smile, but the fierce severity in his eyes lessened, replaced by something else. An invitation. A question. Jane looked at the feather, then at the man beside her. She looked at the untamed land stretching out before them. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a threat, but like an open trail. She slipped the feather back into her pocket and nudged her mule forward, riding alongside him into the rising sun. She was no longer alone, and so the story of Jane Finch and the man they called Ghost Bear passed into the legends of the Old West. It wasn't a tale of grand romance, but something more real, more powerful, a story of a bond forged in secrets and sealed in defiance. It reminds us that sometimes justice isn't found in a courtroom, but in the courage of a single person who dares to stand against the crowd. It shows that in the harshest of lands, the greatest strength can come from the most unlikely of allies, and that a debt of honor is more binding than any law written on paper. Their journey forward was uncertain, but they faced it together, two outsiders against the world, writing a new story in the dust of the American frontier. If this story from the untamed West captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with a friend who appreciates tales of grit, justice, and the wild spirit of the frontier. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories from a time when legends weren't born, they were made.